Hi, everyone. In this week's readings, we focus on the Hispanic Americans, who are just one of the number of groups that we focus on. And um, one of the major concepts that we are exploring is Hispanic culture and what are the factors that have contributed to the growth in the Hispanic population and how that has impacted the face of America. Today. So let's first look at some of the stuff that Morris talks about. One of the first things that he talks about is the browning of America, which is basically in reference to the increasing prevalence of the Hispanic population and the increasing dispersal of Hispanics across the US. So one of the things that we note is that Hispanic, and Mueller talks about this, is that Hispanic does not equal homogeneous. Hispanics hail from different countries, different regions, and with that comes different cultural nuances that we have to be cognizant of when we are dealing with Hispanics. So we have the Mexicans, who are part of North America. We also have Puerto Ricans, who are actually the only group that is American. We do have also Cubans, Dominicans from Central America. We have countries like Panama, El Salvador, Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua. We also have the South Americans, Argentina, Bolivia, Chile, Colombia, Ecuador, Peru, Paraguay, Uruguay, and Venezuela. And so, as you can see, these people are hailing from different regions, and in some regions, you have a larger Afro population, which has resulted in the Afro Hispanic that many people don't think of. But yes, there is a strong, so for example, countries like Cuba, the Dominican Republic have strong Afro Hispanic populations. So does Colombia as well. Even Mexico has an Afro Hispanic population. And so when we talk about Hispanics, we want to recognize that Hispanics are not homogeneous, meaning they're not exactly the same. They are from different regions, so the influences are different, and we have to bear that in mind. But by far, the largest Hispanic group is the Mexican population, and they are basically driving the growth of the Hispanic population in the U.S. And we saw where in 2000, the 2000 census, the Hispanics surpassed African Americans as the largest minority ethnic group, and that was primarily driven by the growth in the Mexican American population. In the 2010 census, we saw where it was even more prevalent, such that Hispanic births in the U.S. Accounted for over half of the growth in the overall U.S. population. And so we are seeing where the Hispanic population is growing or has grown and will continue to grow. And by 2050, we expect that they should be about 30% of the population. And then combined with the other groups, that's how they will become. Minorities will become combined the majority in the U.S., right? One of the things that has been as a result of this growth in the Hispanic population is that there is now an increasing amount of dispersal across states. So before we had or states that we traditionally expected to have larger Hispanic populations. So we were thinking about states like Texas, California, Florida, New Mexico, right? Nevada. And if you look back at the work of Mueller, you will see how those states actually ended up having higher populations. So, for example, in Florida, it was as a result of Cuban immigration that really powered the growth. But then we have the other states, the western states, were actually part of Mexico. And at the end of the Mexican-American War, those states became part of America, and so those people were, in essence, American at the end of that period based on the reallocation. But now we're seeing where, because of the increasing populations, we have now more competition for resources, more competition for jobs, and so we're seeing more dispersal to other states that you would not traditionally have thought of as places where you had strong Hispanic populations. Ohio is an example. There has been an increase in the Hispanic population, and now there are strong Hispanic communities in the state of Ohio, in the Cleveland area. Right? One of the things that Morse discusses in his work is the concept of, with this browning of America, with this increase in immigration, there has been a concern expressed by scholars who feel that these groups will not change, and so they are creating kind of a bicultural U.S. culture. And in the past, as we have discussed in previous weeks, it used to result in a situation where immigrants, Hispanic immigrants, were basically advised, parents were advised by teachers not to speak to their children in Spanish, basically forced them to learn English so that they would not have that accent in English, to improve their acceptance and their success. And so in the 80s and early 90s, that used to be the situation. And so we have a lot of Hispanics who don't have the language capability, and Morse discusses the concept of retroacculturation, because these people, even though they were forced to learn the English language, they feel that yearning for that other side of their background that they are not so much in touch with, and having lost the language, they feel as if that is something important that was taken away from them. And so we have now this retroacculturation where these persons willingly go out and try to seek that connection, try to learn about that other side of their background, which is in many instances the Hispanic side, the Mexican side. And so they spend time learning the language, and it is important to them. One of the things, though, that we have to recognize is that whole concept of retroacculturation is not as important for the latter generations of Hispanics, because, again, America has gotten to a point where that whole forced assimilation is not a thing anymore. And so Hispanic children are taught now from birth, even being born in the U.S., to value their culture, to embrace it, to embrace the language as well, and to be proud of their cultural background. And so these children are now being raised with an appreciation for their culture and a connection to. And so retroacculturation is more of an issue for immigrants from the 80s and 90s who are here now and are now getting reconnected to their culture. One of the things, as I said before, is that even though we see where Hispanics are from very diverse background, and Bueller does spend some time talking about that, what we also see is that there are unifying factors that culturally make it possible for us to speak to them, or to really communicate with them as a group. And one of the things is the language. Most of these countries are Spanish language countries, with the exception of Brazil, which the language is Portuguese, right? And even though these countries have their different dialects, there is no pure Spanish, as Mueller points out. However, generally people can understand any communication that is put forward in Spanish. Whether or not they feel that it is directed at them, that is a completely different issue. One of the things we consider is that because Mexican Americans account for over 70% of the Hispanic population, many organizations who are trying to reach Hispanics will use the Mexican Mexican Spanish, and because they're going for the mass audience. However, if depending on where you're located, that may not necessarily be the best thing. So, for example, when you think about states like Texas and California, yes, strong Mexican Hispanic population, but in New York, it's more mixed, and New York and New Jersey, more mixed, but predominantly Puerto Rican, right? We are seeing, yes, where Florida is mostly Cuban, and Cuban Hispanics think that they are extremely different than the Mexican Hispanics. So that is something to bear in mind. But going back to unifying factors, so language is one. People tend to be able to understand each other in Spanish, regardless of the form that is being used. Religion, right? Strong Christian background, predominantly Catholic, right? Which has implications for some of the values that they have. So in the Catholic in the Catholic faith, people believe to some extent that they have not much control over the future. God's willing is something that is commonly used, and that is because they feel that God does have a lot of control over the future. We are not in control, of course. Being Catholic would also have implications, for example, for beliefs around marriage. Marriage is for life, right? Reproduction as well. We know that in terms of conversations regarding birth control and stuff like that, you do have where the Catholic faith does not endorse birth control, does not encourage it, right? One of the other things that Hispanics as a whole see as very important is La Familia, which is the concept of family. Family is everything. And so we have, as I mentioned in my previous video, that you have where they're more likely to have extended family living with them. They are likely to have bigger families, right? They are likely to, they are less likely to use the nursing home option for elderly members of their family as well. The Hispanic culture is also very child-centric, which means your children, women, especially for women, and we see the concept of Marianismo, which is the woman's duty to sacrifice everything for her family. And we see in the discussions where there's a discussion of the food culture, which is an expression of love, an expression of duty on the part of the Hispanic woman. And so a lot of time is spent preparing meals for the family, right? We also see the concept of machismo. And in many instances, machismo has been given a negative connotation, but machismo is not that. Is not what people think it is. It really is the thought process that the Mexican man is supposed to be: long-suffering, hard-working, also not showing his or her pain or suffering outwardly, but it is expressed through music, as is discussed in I think it's Mueller's book that does talk about that. We see also that there is a lot of conversation both in Mueller and in Morse about this whole Spanish versus English language debate. And one of the things that we have to be clear about is that as Hispanics, further out generationally, meaning third, fourth generation, the bilingual or English dominance capacity is more, right? And so then the focus is not necessarily on language, but more about culture, because a Hispanic not speaking Spanish does not mean that they are separated from their culture, or that they don't appreciate their culture, or that you can't connect with them culturally as Hispanics, right? What we have to understand is that their identity is not just based on their parents' background, meaning, Mexican or Puerto Rican, but they're also American. And so we have seen in the readings where they talk about different organizations, different media outlets who have probably foundered or failed because they have focused on, for example, in language, targeting a particular niche who are connected to home country culture, but the expression is different because one of the things that I've underscored is that as these generations are born here and they are connecting with the culture, they're connecting differently. You cannot treat a Hispanic who was born in the U.S., whose mother probably was born in the U.S., but their grandparents are from another country. You can't treat them the same as you would an immigrant who was not born here, because these people are American. They do identify with the culture. They are bicultural at the very least, because being Hispanic does not make them less American. It's just make them a different type of American, and that is something that we have to understand. One of the things that has been brought up, and that I will reiterate here, is that it is becoming increasingly more important for us to be able to communicate with them through mainstream channels, not just the various media outlets that have been created for those groups. So it's not just Univision or Telemundo or Tres or whichever channels that are available in Spanish language. Those are important. They will continue to be important, but Hispanics no longer just want to see themselves on those channels. They want to see themselves in the mainstream. They want to see themselves reflected as not just a special population, but as a part of the U.S. general population, which means communication should be in culture, not just in language. And so you can have an English language commercial that is targeted towards Hispanics, that touches them on a cultural level, and that is becoming more and more the demand. One of the things I want to clarify, though, if you read Morse chapter, I think that's chapter 2 or 3, you will see where he talks about assimilation. Be very, very careful, because even though he uses the word assimilation, what is really implied in the work that in the words that he writes about is really acculturation, where you adopt a lot of American culture, but that Mexican foundation still remains. And remember, the whole concept of acculturation is that you take on certain aspects of another culture because you are here, you are experiencing it, but that doesn't mean that you begin to lose your identity or the affinity that you have for your home country culture. You may learn the language, you may wear the clothes, you may eat the food, you may celebrate some of the festivals, but that doesn't mean that your identification with home country culture or your parents' culture based on the upbringing has gone. So again, we are moving away from that concept of assimilation, and we are using now that concept of acculturation, which means those two cultures coexisting within a person, right? And within society as a whole. Let's see. There is quite a bit of stuff that I really want you guys to pay very close attention to as you read those chapters, especially looking at Morse and Mueller as they talk about how the media landscape has changed, how advertising agencies have changed. They still continue to fight about Spanish versus English, but one of the things I want to underscore is regardless of language, it has to be in culture. And the reality is, when you have a Spanish dominant, English dominant, or bilingual population, then it's becoming increasingly more important to not just focus on communicating to Hispanics in Spanish on Spanish language media, but also representing Hispanics in culture in mainstream. That's all I have for you guys today. Please, please, please read the chapters before you try to do the assignment. And please review the checklist for this week for the assignment. Please go ahead and make sure that in your doing of the assignment, please use updated statistics. Morse and Muella are outdated. That material is old in terms of numbers. Please don't use those numbers. And with that, I'll talk to you guys soon.